Good morning. Recording progress. Good morning. My name is Panelists, and I am the Social and Human Sciences Program Specialist at the UNESCO Cluster Office for the Caribbean. And on behalf of the University of the West Indies and UNESCO, I would like to welcome you all to our launch event today, which will be focused on shaping an inclusive and equitable COVID-19 recovery policy agenda in the Caribbean region. To begin, I would like to first give the floor to Dr. Sadia Sanchez-Vegas, Director and Representative of the UNESCO Cluster Office for the Caribbean, for opening remarks. Director, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paula. Dear Professor Dr. Clive Landis, Provice Counselor for Undergraduate Studies and Principal Designate of the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill Campus, and Chair of the UE COVID-19 Task Force. Dr. Anna Kasafi Perkins, Senior Program Officer at the Quality Assurance Unit, Office of the Board for Undergraduate Studies, and member of the UE COVID-19 Task Force, University of the West Indies. Representative of Caribbean ministries, civil society organizations, and academia, dear colleagues, distinguished guests, good morning. On behalf of UNESCO, it is my privilege to warmly welcome you to the launch of the publication entitled Towards a More Inclusive Post-COVID-19 Recovery, a tool to further the Caribbean policy agenda. We are pleased to present this knowledge tool today, focusing on the results from the dialogue sessions on equitable and inclusive recovery, held in close collaboration with the University of the West Indies. The COVID-19 pandemic and the measures imposed to curb its spread have substantially impacted our life and livelihoods. It has widened inequalities and heightened the exclusion of disadvantaged and vulnerable groups. In the Caribbean, government have now started to ease the restrictions accompanying for the past 2 years. We have had restrictions for 2 years now. However, we should not forget that the pandemic and its effects are far from over. For example, women continue to be disproportionately affected. Many women who lost or quit their jobs at the onset of the pandemic have still not returned to the labor market, having faced an increased burden of care responsibilities linked to school and daycare closures. In turn, many women are now reconsidering work arrangements that allow for flexibility and an improved work-life balance. Likewise, we should not forget that women have been at the front lines of fighting the pandemic, representing 73% of healthcare workers in the Latin American and the Caribbean region. 73%, according to the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC. While there is an extensive and great political will, we acknowledge that, to channel investment into the priorities of the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, Latin America and the Caribbean is the region with the most prominent external debt relative to GDP. This reduces fiscal space and limits the possibility of Caribbean countries investing in equitable and inclusive recovery efforts towards sustainable development. Furthermore, the small island developing states, SIDS, have been recognized by the international community as a special case for development, being extremely vulnerable to external shocks, including pandemics and extreme weather events. Therefore, within this context, addressing the inequalities created and exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic to foster an equitable recovery is reaffirmed. UNESCO's initiative, amplifying the voice of Caribbean small island developing states towards an inclusive recovery from COVID-19, acknowledges the uniqueness of the Caribbean subregion. The initiative which was part of UNESCO's COVID response in the region, aimed at building multi-stakeholder partnerships and promoting knowledge on recovery efforts in Caribbean cities. One component of the initiative conducted throughout 2021 in partnership through this excellent partnership with the University of the West Indies, aim to create a joint understanding of different facets of equitable COVID-19 recovery. In this regard, we convened 3 dialogue sessions which brought together a cross-section of Caribbean society, including scholars, youth, policymakers, activists, persons with disabilities, and civil society organizations. The first dialogue session, entitled Youthful Exuberance, Re-engaging Youth in an Inclusive Recovery from COVID-19, was highly relevant as more than 63% of persons in the countries of the Caribbean community are below the age of 30. Likewise, young people are a demographic that was highly affected by rising unemployment rates and school closures on the onset of the pandemic. This is why UNESCO and the EU will continue to advocate for youth-inclusive policy for an equitable recovery. The second dialogue session shone a light on rising unemployment and labor participation with a specific focus on women. This session sparked meaningful conversations about how we can leverage the momentum of the pandemic as an opportunity to reimagine work-life systems that are centered on people's well-being. The third dialogue session delved into socioeconomic aspects, and participants jointly defined population groups that would need special attention through specific social policies for a genuinely inclusive recovery process. While each dialogue session was different, they all intersected around amplifying the voice of vulnerable populations and analyzing the complex and often systemic inequalities that need to be addressed in order to contribute to reshaping the Caribbean's long-term policy agenda towards an inclusive recovery in the region. By bringing together the knowledge of practitioners, the experience of policymakers, as well as evidence from academia, we were able to obtain key policy recommendations for shaping an inclusive and equitable recovery in the Caribbean small island developing states. Drawing on these exchanges with experts and policymakers from across the English and Dutch-speaking Caribbean, many of whom have joined us today, we are most pleased to present you with a tool to further Caribbean policy agenda. The tool has been designed to be a model which can guide the development of more inclusive public policies in the region. It also highlights the role of the social and human sciences, which offers a unique perspective to understanding the complexity of human behavior, institutions, and public policies, both during the COVID-19 pandemic and now when planning for the next normal. At UNESCO, we believe that strengthening social science capacities at national and regional level is a building block for an inclusive and comprehensive COVID-19 response. Through our work, we aim to reach research, policy, and practice, and this is why we join forces with the University of the West Indies. We are extremely thankful for these fruitful partnerships and take this opportunity to express on behalf of UNESCO our deep appreciation for this collaboration. This leads me to conclude by calling on governments and international development partners to advocate for more funding opportunities for small island developing states. We need further investment in robust data systems and closer cooperation between government and research institutions to foster, as we have said, and I have said, an equitable recovery in the Caribbean. I look forward to an inspiring exchange today. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Director, for your opening remarks. And indeed, it is only through strong partnerships and a strong vision for promoting social inclusion that we can work on amplifying the voice of Caribbean small island developing states for an equitable recovery. We greatly welcome the spirit of collaboration with the University of the West Indies throughout this process, and therefore I would like now to give the floor to one individual who was critical for the success of this project, Professor Clive Landis, Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill Campus, Barbados. Professor Landis, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. I do want to echo what Director Dr. Sanchez-Vegas has said. This has just been such a pleasant collaboration. I think UNESCO and UWI just fit together like hand in glove. You know, UWI, we can find experts on every topic that affects the Caribbean. But sometimes, you know, do we interact as well as we could with policymakers? But UNESCO, you know, brings the clout and the ability to bring policymakers to the table, and you know, those dialogue sessions that the director referred to were really well attended. And you know, I think now that we have this knowledge product, it's going to be needed again, so that policymakers do use it, because I think it is a very valuable product. A lot of what I had written down was going to say, and the director has already said. So I think I will just maybe speak a little bit about the persons involved and the relationships that we established as we went through this process. It all really began with Dr. Perkins and I writing an ebook that we published ourselves, you know, on Smashwords. It was great fun. It took us a couple of weeks to write. You know, we were not lying when we said it's a brief handbook. It's very brief. It's about ethical decision-making in the Caribbean. And my goodness, this little publication has delivered again and again and again. So someone was obviously reading it, and we got a call from Paula and Juliana. And they said, well, you know, we read your ethics handbook, and we think you're identifying some of these problems with the pandemic, because the pandemic in essence in the Caribbean is like a bipolar pandemic. On the one hand, we've handled it very well in the Caribbean. Thankfully, we have much lower death rates than in North America and South America. However, the economic and the social impact has been outsized and really extreme. And really, you know, when you look at the vulnerability to external shocks that Director Sanchez-Vegas spoke about, it was really just a recapitulation of the Barbados Protocol for Action, which was the first time that small island developing states were recognized in the UN system. It was really just a living reenactment of everything that was predicted happened. And so, you know, this vulnerability is very, very real. And those inequalities in our societies were just simply widened further by the pandemic. So we were invited to contribute to a knowledge piece for the Inclusive Policy Lab that UNESCO has. And, you know, they liked our piece, so they said, well, now we want another one. So we made two. And then we found that through UWI and through other contacts, it then grew into 7 pieces, which had a much broader reach, not just academia, but also gender advocates and persons with disabilities and youth voice. And this was really a lovely product in itself. And then, you know, Juliana and Paula said, well, we want more. And so we brought in Don Marshall, who's an expert on socioeconomic development. We brought in Stacey Kennedy, who is Pro-Vice Chancellor for Global Affairs. And we then went to the larger set of discussions, amplifying the voice of the Caribbean and towards a more inclusive post-COVID-19 recovery. And the idea, of course, is having identified which groups are more impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, those groups need to be at the table to make the policy, so that if they're the most impacted, their voice must be heard at the policymaking stage. And so we held these three panel discussions, which were themed. Anna has a great gift for words. She can take a very sort of boring sounding topic like reimagining work-life systems, and then she puts something in front of it. She says, "What a way to make a living!" and it is true. It has been very bizarre and strange to make a living for many people in the COVID-19 pandemic. Many people were essentially criminalized for needing to go to work and put bread on the table. What a way to make a living. So, I think throughout this process, Anna has been the principal investigator. I really do want to give her full credit for bringing not just a sense of organization, but also a sense of, I think, purpose and a bit of fun to the whole process. I have really enjoyed this collaboration with UNESCO. I think it's been so productive, and we need to do more. I agree 100% with Dr. Sanchez Vegas. Let's go on to the next topic. We have so much in ways that we can collaborate and synergize with each other. So I'm looking forward to hearing the digest that Anna will produce about our final knowledge product. And we're very, very proud at the university to have worked with UNESCO to deliver towards a more inclusive post-19 COVID recovery, a tool to further the Caribbean policy agenda. I'm looking forward to the panel discussion coming up. Thank you very much on behalf of everyone at UE, and I'm sure we have more collaborations ahead of us.
Thank you very much, Professor. In the Caribbean, the pandemic has had multidimensional consequences, ranging from putting a strain on the region's healthcare sector, impacting learning outcomes, causing loss of livelihoods, while disproportionately impacted women, youth, and persons with disabilities. As Dr. Landis said, a polar pandemic. As mentioned by our director in her opening remarks, the outcomes and policy recommendations stemming from the 3 dialogue sessions conducted during 2021 served to elaborate the joint publication Toward a More Inclusive Post-COVID Recovery, a tool to further the Caribbean policy agenda. This knowledge product presents a policy analysis tool to further promote social inclusion in public policies. Therefore, today's event will be divided in 2. First, we'll have a conversation with participants of the dialogue sessions who will shed light on this process and the main outcomes. And then we'll conclude with a deep dive into the policy tool, which will be led by our colleagues at the University of the West Indies under the leadership of Dr. Anna Perkins. So before we begin, I will briefly introduce our panelists. Today, we are joined by Miranda Blackman, who's an entrepreneur and member of the Barbados National Youth Policy Coordinating Committee. We are also joined by Mr. Benito Wheatley, Special Envoy at the British Virgin Islands Government, Professor Alger Henry Lee, Director of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies at the University of the West Indies. So we will have a brief dialogue first with them. We aim for the event to be interactive with possibilities for the audience to ask questions. So please feel free to write your questions in the chat box, and we will share them with our guests throughout the conversation. To our panelists, we would like to have a kind reminder to keep your questions to 2 to 3 minutes so that we can have time to address questions from the audience as well. And so thank you everyone for joining us today. And I will begin then with my first question, which is for Miranda Blackman, who participated in Dialogue 1, Youthful Exuberance, Reimagining Youth in an Inclusive Recovery. In the Caribbean community, as our director mentioned, around 63% of the population is under the age of 30. While youth have faced specific challenges, they have also been at the forefront of the pandemic, leading community-based initiatives and really helping their peers. And this is why the first dialogue session was focused completely on the impact of the pandemic on youth. So, Ms. Blackman, my question would be, based on the outcomes of the dialogue, of the first dialogue, can you share with us the three main challenges that were identified by youth as a consequence of the pandemic, and furthermore, what are the three key recommendations that stem from this dialogue for enhancing youth engagement in a post-pandemic Caribbean?
Good morning, everyone. First, let me thank you for having me as a panelist and also as a participant in the first dialogue. I'll try to be quite brief with my remarks. There were quite a few areas brought up as challenges being faced by the youth in this robust discussion. The Caribbean is very, very diverse and unique in some of the challenges it faces geographically and socially. And within those challenges lie other unique subdivisions for each country. So I would say three of the main issues were number one, unemployment and underemployment. So many of the individuals were laid off during the pandemic, as we know, and it's usually the last in who will be the first out. So many young people lost their jobs. And as a result, many were settling for any form of employment that presented itself as it was necessary basically for them to sustain their livelihoods and to have sustainable development. Number two, what I would say is crime and violence, especially relating to women being exploited and abused. So going back to the point where many were being laid off, a lot of young women were forced to be quarantining and resided in abusive situations. And, the pandemic really hit different angles and brought forth mental health issues and financial difficulties. And the violence unfortunately increased. And some who have lived in abusive environments found solace in, being able to go to work, being able to go out, being able to interact with others socially. We're confined to those quarters. And then you have those who, for the first time, might have experienced the abuse simply due to the fact of stress, of losing your job and the other uncertainties of the future. It really put a strain on the family and in the households, and that really increased verbal and physical as well as emotional abuse for many of the young women in our societies. Number three, what I would say is definitely education and educational pursuits. So many of us pursuing education at all levels, had challenges as it was disrupted due to the pandemic. And this includes both, we broke them down into adolescent youth and adult youth, because, there's a difference, because youth is quite vast. Not having limited Wi-Fi and also technological access was proven to be difficult. And then you had those within the households where there were many children. So, the older siblings and older members had to sacrifice their own education to make sure the younger ones actually got a chance to get what they could in terms of education. And unfortunately, some people had to leave school to cater to their families, as well as any of the family members who were vulnerable and ill. Also, a challenge was that a lot of the sporting programs and vocational training programs offered were no longer existing. So many felt left behind educationally, because we know that education really sometimes is the way forward for a better future. And they have been feeling stinted, not being able to pursue the education due to this pandemic. So with those three, so even though those were the main issues, others such as the further marginalization of minority groups, as was mentioned prior, such as the LGBTQ+ and those with disabilities, including myself, climate change and mitigate migrant youth, healthcare and health were also heavily discussed. To answer the second part, which were the recommendations coming out of that discussion, three of the main recommendations, number one, were collaboration and communication, because yes, we do need to bring youth to the forefront. We do need to bring us to the table. They said engaging youth in conversation instead of that top-down approach, bringing it from the bottom up really would make a great difference in rebuilding following this pandemic. Having open and honest conversation and dialogue. Number two, and I love this, I'm not sure if anyone remembered, but it was mentioned, AVAS, which is acknowledge, value, include, and support the youth. It's always easy to say that you want youth to be involved or you will involve the youth, but we thought it was necessary to also be supportive of the youth and the ideas brought forth by them, which will be truly impactful in the long term. And number three were the implementation of programs, getting youth involved in the implementation of programs. And one program that was talked about was the Youth Entrepreneurship Scheme, which is present here in Barbados. It was mentioned that if programs such as this were expanded in other countries, it would offer other alternatives, give the youth opportunities and skills needed for sustainable development to rebuild following this pandemic. And as we're still in the pandemic, we are excited and hopeful for what the tool that UNESCO and UWI has worked on will mean and bring for us and our children. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miranda, for this really comprehensive summary of the dialogue session 1 and highlighting the importance of not only developing youth-focused policies and programs, but also including youth in decisions that affect them. And I think this was one of the biggest outcomes as well from the dialogue. So thank you so much. My next question is for Mr. Wheatley. He participated in the second dialogue entitled, "What a Way to Make a Living, Reimagining Work-Life Systems." Indeed, the pandemic continues to widen gaps in employment and livelihoods. However, it also provides some latitude for reimagining more balanced, sustainable, and equitable work systems in the Caribbean. In this regard, Mr. Wheatley, could you kindly let us know in what ways the COVID-19 pandemic provides avenues for reimagining work-life systems so that they are more inclusive, but also more focused on citizens' well-being?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning to all. In particular, UNESCO Caribbean Cluster Director, Dr. Celia Sanchez Vegas, and the senior leadership of the University of the West Indies present. I'd like to thank UNESCO and the University of the West Indies for the kind invitation to be a part of this launch. COVID-19 has exposed and exacerbated the deficiencies of the economic, social, and health systems on which the people of the Caribbean rely. The pandemic's impact has disproportionately affected the most vulnerable groups in society, including women, children, the elderly, and the disabled. However, recovery from the pandemic presents an opportunity to reimagine work-life systems in a way that would make them more equitable and resilient. Among other things, we need stronger social safety nets to protect the vulnerable during crises, especially persons who are low-wage workers in the hospitality sector, who are the most likely to be laid off or have their hours and income reduced. Unemployment insurance of some kind must be put in place to make the economic system more shock responsive in order to limit the economic damage to the society. We also cannot forget the informal sector and must find a way of extending some form of social safety net to the workers operating there who are not registered in the systems of the official authorities. In terms of the care economy, the value of persons who carry the primary responsibility of caring for children, the elderly, disabled, and sick, especially in the home, should be reflected in a subsidy of some kind to those persons. We cannot continue to ignore the great social and economic value that caretakers bring to society. Finally, while work has traditionally been organized around productivity and output, greater consideration should be given to well-being in terms of more flexible work arrangements. Employers, where they can, should do their level best to accommodate working parents and those persons who have caretaking responsibilities. COVID response across our societies has already demonstrated that there's a great deal of work activities that can be done virtually while at home or elsewhere. I should mention here that these are steps the British Virgin Islands is taking, which requires greater consultation and collaboration between the public sector, private sector, and civil society. The main point is that we can no longer afford to separate work from family and community, especially if we are to successfully rebalance work-life systems toward well-being. Failing to make this much-needed shift would only perpetuate the existing mental health challenges and inequalities that have already been amplified by the pandemic. Madam Chair, in the interest of time, I end here, but wish to congratulate UNESCO and the University of the West Indies on the publication of the knowledge tool to assist the relevant stakeholders in their efforts to achieve a more inclusive recovery. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wheatley. And we also thank you as well for being a panelist when we did the second dialogue session. And so it's really great to count on the support of the British Virgin Islands in this endeavor. We're very, very honored for this. And thank you as well for really highlighting the importance of the linkages between work, family, and community, and the fact that through the pandemic, or based on the pandemic, we can no longer ignore that these are all intertwined, and that work-life systems should be working as well towards the well-being of our citizens in the Caribbean. And so my next question is for Professor Henry Lee. She was a participant or a panelist as well during our third dialogue, Faring Well, Welfare, Reimagining Socioeconomic Recovery. And I think this could link very interestingly to what Mr. Wheatley was saying. And my question would be, in this second dialogue, we discussed how a one-size-fits-all approach to socioeconomic recovery does not really encompass all groups that can be in vulnerable situations, and in many cases can even amplify inequalities. Professor Henry Lee, could you kindly shed light on the importance of social protection and safety nets as a key mechanism to ensure an inclusive COVID-19 recovery, and what is perhaps the role of Caribbean universities in this regard?
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the invitation to this important engagement. And congratulations to the organizers, UWI and UNESCO, and the authors of this important policy tool. I read it and I'm quite impressed. As you know, ladies and gentlemen, the pandemic has highlighted pre-existing inequalities and issues of social exclusion in the provision of social protection in the Caribbean. And there are groups who will be further left behind in the fulfillment of the UN 2030 agenda. So we have to take special attention, pay special attention to these groups. And there are countries that we need to even look more closely at, and these are countries with double burdens, natural disasters and pandemics like St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We have Haiti, we have triple burdens there with civil unrest, natural disasters, pandemic, etc. So there are some countries who are even more vulnerable than others. So focus on social protection should not just be about handouts, but they should be about building resilience of vulnerable groups, transforming lives permanently, because unfortunately we expect to have more pandemics and more natural disasters. So deliberate strategies must be implemented to reduce social inclusion and to provide social protection in a timely, ethical, very important, appropriate, efficient, effective manner, respecting the rights and dignities of all beneficiaries. And ILO, there's a very good ILO report, social protection report, that tells us that we need to take urgent, decisive action to close those coverage and adequacy gaps that became apparent during the crisis and make sure that we strengthen our social protection systems. The other area that I want us to pay special attention to is mental health. The pandemic has showed us that mental health crisis of all groups, and if we use a life cycle approach, it seems that the mental health crisis is among all the groups in the life cycle. So we have to be very, very careful and make sure that we provide 24-hour helplines and we provide access, affordable access to psychological support. The mental health crisis, we should pay very much attention to it. We have to think family when we are providing social protection, that when we deal with children, we also have to deal with parents. For example, if we are dealing with children with disabilities, we need to provide support groups for the families and the parents, because we are doing a study in the Caribbean right now, and one of the themes coming out is the stress that the parents of those children with disabilities, they are experiencing high levels of stress. So we have to have a place where they can vent. So deliberate efforts must be made to be more inclusive. We have to target many vulnerable groups and groups in each age cohort of the life cycle, but so I can look at the children, the youth, very excellent presentation by a young representative, the elderly, women, persons with disabilities, illegal migrants, indigenous people, LGBTQI individuals, persons living below the poverty line, etc. In terms of the role of the university, of course, there are several roles. One of them is, of course, disseminating this very tool, very important tool. I would suggest that Dr. Perkins sends it to all faculties, especially the social sciences, so that we can introduce the tool in our classes and make sure that it is used as a teaching tool, and also make sure that our policymakers have it as a handbook as they try to implement policy. Of course, as a university and Caribbean universities, speaking specifically of UWI, I'm very biased, of course. I think we are doing an excellent job. So we continue to train in policy design, monitoring and evaluation, which is very key. And our previous speaker spoke about the importance of including participants in the monitoring evaluation of those social protection strategies. We want to create and promote at the universities creativity and innovations, very key aspects of the tool that I read about. We talk about people-centered social protection. The university can provide opportunities for groups to speak with policymakers, to speak among themselves, because they want a safe space where nobody will be judging them and they can air their concerns freely. So we can provide that at the university. Research, of course, key. We have different types of research. We want those rapid assessments that can be done quickly to see whether a strategy is being effective, it's being targeted properly. We are covering the right and adequate. And we can also be involved in longitudinal studies, which will be more effective in terms of telling us what the impact of a particular strategy is. So we want to be part of that evidence-based policy formulation, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. We can be advocates for the vulnerable groups. In the persons with disabilities, we have Senator Morris right here at Muna, who is a great advocate of persons with disabilities. So we want to continue to be advocates for all the vulnerable groups. And of course, we can be involved with outreach to the vulnerable groups, supporting vulnerable societies and vulnerable groups. So, for example, Salises is doing an outreach program with Haiti, a school in Haiti where they need so many resources that we are trying to mobilize resources to support them. So these are some of the areas, and I know you, in the interest of time, I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Henry Lee, for sharing these insights and for really capturing the importance of thinking about different population groups and the type of support, specific support that they would need. Now, I think, well, we're running a little bit behind, but I will open the floor to some questions to our panelists. If there's any, you're invited to write them down in the chat. And we might maybe have 1 or 2 questions for the panelists if there's any questions. Okay, so there's the first question. Okay, there's a question for Professor Henry Lee, and it says, we see that the COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately impacted women, both on the front line, but also at home, juggling multiple duties of care. In your view, what specific policy measures need to be put in place to ensure that women are equally included in the recovery process? And I might link this to what also Mr. Wheatley was mentioning about burdens of care and the importance of that in policy design. Professor Henry.
Yes, so women, as we know, have been at the center of both I would say, the response and in the impact and the care strategies for the pandemic. So that we know and we start to worry because SDG 5, which is aimed at reducing gender inequality, we are losing ground in the fulfillment of SDG 5. And we know that the women have been impacted, layoffs and job cuts. We have, especially for single female-headed households who tend to be predominant among the persons and households below the poverty line. We have rural women, we have rural households where women and women in agriculture, we have seen research coming in about the increase in poverty, increase in hunger. We have remote, the fact that women have to be, during the pandemic, were at home, having to take care of the family and also work remotely. So they have a double burden. And we have women who, as difficult as it may seem, they cannot work at home. So they are, in fact, having the stress of trying to manage work arrangements and taking care of the family, the elderly, etc. So that care industry that the previous speaker spoke about is so important. And there are some groups, women, that are more vulnerable than others. So, and I yield to my colleague Leaf Dunn in her presentation. She was pointing out that while we don't put women in one group, there are in fact subgroups that we have to take care of. The pregnant women, women who are breastfeeding, women with smaller children, older women, women with disabilities, homeless women, and a group that we don't even pay attention to is women in prison. We have to, that's an area of research that I'm very interested in. And lockdown and curfews have increased the violence against women. So there's what we call a shadow pandemic taking place, which is the gender-based violence, which has increased. So what do we need to do? I know the time is going. We need to ensure that we target those various groups of women. We can't treat all women as the same. We need to educate women. We need to spend a lot of time finding those girls who did not come to school, who did not access online learning. Where are they? Some of them are being beaten. Some of them are involved, are pregnant. I was told by one educator in Jamaica that some of the girls, when you find them, they have been abused and they are pregnant. So you have to find a way for continuing education. Women in the rural areas, women in the impoverished urban areas, because there are some areas in Jamaica, for example, where we have women who are under abuse because they are in this violent impoverished ghettos and they are being abused by women. So women in the care industry, we have to improve pay, we have to improve social protection for them, lift as I said before, think of the family. So we have to lift them out of as much as possible from inadequate coverage. The benefit is inadequate, the coverage is inadequate, and so we need to think family, think different aspects of social protection. One of the things that I think we need to help women to do is to establish support groups so that they have a safe space that they can talk and unburden themselves. And I think that's one of the things that we have to think about. We have to get a safe space for women who have been abused and women who are recovering. So it's not just to come to the psychologist one day, but to have a safe space where you can talk to other victims and vent. And so we could continue. In the interest of time, I'll stop here, but we could write a paper on this topic.
Thank you so much. It is an interesting topic, and I think it was brought up by all panelists on the specific impact of the COVID pandemic on women. So thank you so much, Dr. Henry Lee, Professor Henry Lee. I was wondering if we have maybe time for one more question, if there's any other question on from the audience, but maybe there isn't. Okay. There's a question for Mr. Wheatley. And it says, the COVID pandemic has also revealed an existing digital divide. In your view, what necessary measures need to be taken to promote greater digitalization to improve resilience in the face of crisis? So I'm going to hand over the floor to Mr. Wheatley. If you can keep your answer nice and short, that would be greatly appreciated.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. As you have rightly stated, the pandemic has revealed a digital divide. This digital divide in many ways reflects the inequalities of society. The inequalities are in our societies in which the poor and those in rural areas have less access to internet service and the digital technologies needed to engage meaningfully in the world today. The various formal and informal digital access surveys that were conducted during the pandemic to assist education systems in delivering education via virtual classrooms have given us a clearer picture of things. We now have a much better idea of the extent of the digital divide and who has been left behind. We cannot ignore this divide any longer because the world is now more digital than it has ever been due to the pandemic. To keep pace, the Caribbean will have to further digitize in terms of the functioning and operation of society and the ability of the region to compete economically. On the positive side of things, we now know which households lack digital access. We also have a stock of devices from the pandemic period that can be redeployed to those households most in need, since the pressure for virtual education has eased with students back in the classroom. In terms of internet service, we need to ensure that access is available in public spaces such as libraries, community centers, and specific hotspots in towns and villages, so that those persons without service at home can have some form of access. Special hotspot devices can also be issued for home use to those households that cannot afford internet service by making special arrangements between the government and telecom providers. It behooves all of the relevant government authorities and their partners to revamp their digital strategies to address the gaps highlighted by the pandemic. This is what we in the British Virgin Islands are preparing to do with the support of UNDP. Now is the time to take action. We cannot afford to leave anyone behind because the future is at stake, and we must be ready for the possibility of another pandemic. And Madam Chair, if I may, just to go back to the previous question, in terms of women and how we ensure they are part of the recovery, I see three things that must be done. One, we need real-time monitoring of the impact on women as we recover. This will require collaboration between the government and civil society groups. We have to have some form of reporting by women on what is happening to them. So I very much agree, we have to put some kind of infrastructure and system in place for that. Two, we have to consult women on the policies that we develop going forward. That is essential. So we have to organize women into the various groups and bring them together to talk about what their needs are going forward. And finally, because we have made so many policies in the past without consulting women, we now need to have a review, a gender review of those policies so that we know where there are deficiencies and weaknesses, and so we can update them accordingly in line with what women say they need. And that's what I would end there, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Mr. Whately, for the insights on the importance of kind of strengthening the digital space in the Caribbean region, but as well in your insights on including and meaningfully including women in decisions that affect them as well. So I will thank now the panelists. We will now move on to our second part of the conversation. And as mentioned before, the recommendation from the dialogue session served to design a policy tool which aims to contribute to shaping the long-term policy agenda in response to the inequalities created and or exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. It is the aim of their tool that it can be used as a model for shaping more inclusive public policies. So this tool was developed through a collaborative effort, taking into account the discussions and insights from key stakeholders in the English and Dutch-speaking Caribbean. And on behalf of UNESCO, we are very grateful for the partnership with the University of the West Indies. I would then like to give the floor to Dr. Anna Perkins, Senior Program Officer, member of the Viewing COVID-19 Task Force, who was the lead author of the knowledge product for a keynote presentation on the policy tool. Dr. Perkins, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paula. I'm taking it that you can see my screen and it's in presentation mode?
Yes, we can.
Brilliant. All right, it worked. Just listening to the presentation and the panelists and the discussion this morning reminded me of what we did together last year and how much fun it was and how much of a learning experience it was. I hope that people who are with us this morning and who would not have been a part of that conversation just got a little bit of a taste of what it meant for us to spend time in that dialogue session, the three that we did, and how rich it was, and just how you had a feeling that what you were doing was really going to be relevant and meaningful. So to start, please allow me to add my own words of thanks. I really have to thank my UNESCO colleagues, thank the Director General for even being willing to accommodate us with this project. But Paul and Juliana, you know I'm going to say special word of thanks to you both. You were such great collaborators to work with on the ground, and we're looking forward to other opportunities to work together. Of course, I have to thank my UA colleagues, no doubt, and Prof. Landis would have gone through and listed all the names, but I think I'm going to shout out especially Melanie, Kenisha, and Sandria, who are here this morning. They were like the backbone of our project and operationalizing a lot of the documentation coming out of it. All right, so thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm happy that we're here this morning to celebrate this product, which has pulled together all the efforts and energy and ideas and expertise that would have been shared with us in those dialogue sessions to have this document, this tool that Prof. Henry Lee referred to so nicely and so well in her own presentation. So what's going on with this actionable tool? Well, certainly it took place within a context of us engaging with the social and human sciences. And that's the UNESCO context that invited us to consider, to collaborate, to conversate, and then of course to come up with a tool. So it gave us an opportunity to place the human person, the individual, both in a communal and a personal space in the center of our conversation. So for someone like me, the moral dimension, notions of social justice, sociocultural and political perspectives are at the heart of our human reality, and we have to treat with those if we're going to be able to contribute to this inclusive recovery, which is so important, given all that we have heard said this morning as we try to make sense of where we are now as Caribbean people in a pandemic situation, hoping to move into a post-pandemic situation. So you would have recognized from what was said and what was shared how important we found participation to be, and the importance of taking account of groups that were most affected, that were in vulnerable situations and circumstances. And you've heard how we foregrounded women, the youth, the elderly, LGBTQ people and so on. So we took very careful account of people and the circumstances that they were living in, and how it is that our process could engage them. So we had a special role. So you heard Miranda speak to us this morning, and you just bubble over with pride, hearing from and listening to and interacting with the young people of our region, and recognizing how creative they can be, and that they're not sitting back and allowing the pandemic to just flow over them, but that they're actively engaging and trying to find ways to ensure that they continue to live and to survive in the face of the challenges. But we did recognize that it was important to engage with our youth, because what's happening right now in this pandemic is affecting the decisions that they're making in terms of where they're going with their lives and just the future of them and the future of our society. So they were very, very key conversation partners, and you would have seen how and why. We also recognized that our response needed to be multifaceted and multilateral. So you recognize that the conversation was not just at the university level, it was not just with youth, it was with vulnerable communities, but it was also with policymakers as well. It was also with researchers, and you heard Prof. Alvili's presentation about what work is happening and where more needs to happen. And we interacted with persons like Mr. Wheatley. Benita brought some really fantastic policy-making insight into the space, because he wasn't speaking theoretically. He was speaking as someone that was actually functioning on the ground in ways that could directly impact how things developed beyond the pandemic and while we're working through. And you heard him speaking to about how we bring women into the conversation more effectively, and how do we take an approach to our policy that actually uses a gender lens to critique and to assess. And you'll see some of that playing itself out in how we developed the tool. We talked about notions of sustainability as well. It's not a one-shot thing where we're going to do something short-term that can't find itself being workable in the future and being able to be maintained going forward. For me, one of the areas of deep growth in the conversation had to do with being sort of shaken, if you want to call it that, by Pat Northover. And it happened, Prof, if you remember, because one of the panel, the dialogue sessions we had invited you to, you weren't able to come. And Pat came as the person representing you. And she really shook us up with her presentation on how racialized and neo-colonial our policy-making frameworks continue to be. And Deb McPhee, who does a lot of work in gender and so on, and she moderated one of our sessions, also put that into the mix as well. So we had to sort of take a step back and recognize that we were still functioning in sort of neo-colonial spaces, and that it was important to recognize those and to make attempts to redress. And for me, just thinking through what's going on on the ground now in the Caribbean, and how in Jamaica and Belize and the Bahamas and so on, we had this pushback against the royal visit and what their continuing to be the head of our countries mean and so on. So we're more knowledgeable and more aware of those kind of neo-colonial framings that we need to take account of. We need to spoke to technology as a tool and the meaningfulness and how we ought to be using technology. We recognize the importance and the meaningfulness of gathering data, and that we weren't doing it in the best way that we could. And data for so many people were being left out of the conversation because they were not able to participate in the conversation. There were some groups that were silent and silenced and on the margin. They were willing to speak. And we can think of the people who are in the disabled community. We can think of our gender minority community as well. So in policy making, we actually have to reach out to some groups. We can't wait for them to come in, but we have to find ways of engaging them so that their voices can be heard. So what you recognize is that we modeled exactly what it is that we were trying to do by the process that we engaged in trying to put together this knowledge tool, this policy design, implementation, and critique model that we presented. So you'll see in this diagram that's here, and I'm giving a very special shout out to Dr. Kay Thompson. I don't think she's with us, but she's one of my colleagues in the quality assurance quality assurance unit. And Kay has a particular talent. Prof is shouting me out for my talent for words. Kay has a talent for designing diagrams to capture ideas, and she did this so brilliantly for us. So I'm giving a real shout out to Dr. Kay Thompson for doing this. So you'll see us capturing here the model of how we undertook our project. And this is the same model that then fed into how we designed the policy tool. So you'll recognize that we saw policy has to be the way that we were to push our deliberations and to push where we could have the most impact. This is where the government says what it's going to do and then uses that to implement what it does, and then hopefully to assess what it does. But what we found was that too often government will frame policy but never implement. Or we also recognize, and I think Miranda brought this up this morning as well, and so did Prof. Henry Lee, that our approaches in policy making, right, Benito, tends to be more sort of top down. So we do our policy design from up here, and we say, this is what we think you need. This is what we think women who are coming from low income communities need, or this is what the disabled need, and so on. But more and more increasingly, and this is part of what Prof and her colleagues are doing in the social sciences at UWI, as we're helping to train future policymakers, as we're helping to train future researchers, we're helping them to recognize that the approach to take is not top down, but it's an approach that is to be inclusive, and that we should pull in voices in many ways that we can. Sometimes it means that we'll have to incentivize persons who are on the margins and don't believe that their voices count, who don't know how to take steps to come into the space to be a part of the conversation. And we've talked about how the pandemic has exacerbated the divisions and the inequalities that are already there in our societies, already there in our region. They have exacerbated, it hasn't exacerbated, at the same time it's also perhaps created, or deepened ones that were there before. So we recognize that we're in spaces where it's increasingly difficult to gather data. But then on the other hand, it's actually a lot easier to gather data, because if we take account of technology and what the pandemic has forced us to do by putting us in a space where we have to rely on certain kinds of technologies, we can build on that to gather data, to make sure it's nice and clean. And this was one of the fascinating kind of discussion that we had too, in understanding how data is gathered, understanding that we don't even have agreement on the meaning of some of the words that we're using. If we're going to be talking about low income, does it mean the same thing across different spaces? You know, what do we mean by care work and all of that? So we were seeing opportunities for us to have conversations and to come to agreements around certain things. And I see Pierre has joined us. Want to say hi to Pierre and to welcome him as well. So opportunity, opportunity, opportunity. What do we have to contribute? And this is where the project ended up. And Prof. Henry Lee, we're taking our hat off to you. You know that you had a really significant role to play in helping us to frame this policy tool by virtue of your presentation to us in that dialogue session. You shared with us the model coming out of the core diagnostic instrument on social protection from the interagency social protection assessments. And what you did was to, from what we saw, to amplify the various criteria and categories that they had by making sure that the vulnerability that was peculiar and you know, sort of defining, if that's a good way of putting it, of the Caribbean region was reflected in that table that you shared with us. So thanking you for allowing us to piggyback on your work, the learning that you allowed us to undertake by interacting with you. And then we could move from that to amplifying this model for ethical policy design, implementation, and assessment. So the MEPDIA model. And this is what it looks like, colleagues. And you'll see it either by getting one of the hard copies. Not many have been done in this day and age. Just click on that link that Juliana has provided in the chat, and you should be able to download a copy of this. And as we're saying, please disseminate it widely. Make sure that in every conversation that you think it's important and relevant, that is shared. All right. So we worked with Prof's 11 criteria, including the whole notion of resilience and respect for rights and dignity, the fact that benefits that are provided should be adequate and so on. But the important thing that we want to emphasize is that this is a simple model. It's a template, it's adoptable and adaptable. We didn't drill down into nitty-gritty to give you, you know, like, okay, what's implementation status? Should it be achieved, not achieved, partially achieved? You know, we didn't try to do any of that with the assessment status or anything like that, because we want it to be a really simple template that can be taken and used in many different spaces and adopted and adapted as necessary. What we wanted to emphasize was that in designing, these are the areas that need to be taken account of, and design should not just be design, but it should also be implementation, and it must include assessment. It must include assessment. And too often that's where the gaps arise, that we implement, but we don't assess, and then we don't feed back in, because, you know, it's really a feedback loop, as we'll talk you through in using our quality assurance lens. If you're going to implement, then you must assess, and then after you assess, then you're going to plug it right back in, and the process continues, you know, using our quality assurance hat and jargon and so on. We're talking about a spiral, a quality improvement spiral, which you can sort of layer onto this template that we're sharing. Won't go through the criteria. You can we can speak to it in conversation. Prof. Henry Lee's here, and she has also already spoken very nicely and very well about the instrument itself, just by her presentation and also to her responses. And Prof, we're really gratified to have you give us a big shout out and to say what we have worked towards and so on, you think is really good and very, very useful. So as I said, it's a process with a tool. And the tool is undergirded by a certain kind of discussion that you have heard here this morning. And the document is very tiny, and UNESCO was very clear with us. They weren't asking us to give them a huge document. They wanted something that could be read easily and be used easily. And that's what we tried to provide. So it's a process that shapes and undergirds the tool. So what we want to say to end, importantly, and we're going to go into discussion, is policy design, implementation, and assessment must be operationalized in ways that do not deepen existing social inequities. Yeah, the tool that we have crafted is one that supports designing and operationalizing and assessing policy while providing data on the outcomes of current policy responses and generating evidence to inform future pandemics, because we know that COVID won't be the first, it hasn't been the first, and it certainly won't be the last. So we need to be sustainable, resilient, and be prepared for what's coming in the future. So again, just many, many thanks to everyone that has been a part of this process. Prof will tell you, Prof Landis will tell you, oh, I love this project, and he speaks for all of us that were involved in this process. Thank you very much again, and over to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perkins, for your leadership and for bringing together all the insights from the different dialogue sessions. I think these actions between you and UNESCO really highlight the deep-rooted commitment to making significant contributions to sustainable development. And furthermore, we also aim to really consider how the human and social sciences can also contribute to build a more inclusive and safer and resilient environment, as you have pointed out in the beginning of your presentation. We are a little bit behind schedule, so I think we are going to kind of wrap up. Juliana has shared the link to the tool in the chat, and as has been mentioned before, we really encourage you to use it and to share it. And if there's any questions, of course, we also remain available. We really want to thank our panelists and our keynote speaker. And we also want to thank all the participants that joined us during the dialogue sessions and without whom it would not have been possible to elaborate this knowledge product. The tool was really a co-created product with all the dialogue session participants. And before we wrap up, we really want to acknowledge all the participants today. And one thing that we did at the end of each dialogue session was to take a photo. And today we have lots of the participants from the different dialogue sessions with us. And so we would really like to take a group photo as we are wrapping up this process today, to thank you as well for your commitment, for being there when we, for your inputs, for the insights that really helped shape and design this knowledge tool. So I think we're going to wrap up with that, unless there's, oh, Mr. Benito Whitley also wants a photo. So yes, we're having a photo.
I love photos.
We're not being without a photo. So yes, let's have a photo. Group, I'll invite you all to turn on your camera. It's so nice to see many of the participants from the different dialogue sessions that have participated. And then, yeah, there's some people who can turn on cameras. Oh, hi, Alana, so good to see you. Mr. Pierre, Mr. Lebert, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, sorry, I'm late.
And so, okay, so Katerina, can you help us? Yeah, were we good?
Sure, please smile.
Hold on a second. We need to get more cameras on. June, Jason, Melanie, come on, guys. Cameras, Delori, Prof. Boxell. Thank you for joining us, Prof. Boxell. Can we have you on camera?
Okay, just give me a second.
Thank you, Mr. Wheatley. And Benito, please meet June Wheatley. You share a name. June's our colleague in the quality assurance unit. Benito is in the BVI, June, so you can trace family roots.
Okay, hello, good to meet you.
Pleased to meet you, cousin.
Okay, I'm here.
Thanks, Prof. Jason, Mr. Mac, turn on. Victoria, Melanie, come on, guys. We don't want to have any black spaces if we can help it.
Oh, okay, come in, Anna.
Yeah, man, hurry up, hurry up.
Huh? It's that famous phrase, I come in just now.
That's how the Bajans would say it, right? We would say, we soon come, I'm coming, soon come. Thank you, Jason. What are we missing? Delori, Tunisia, Melanie, what happened to Melanie? Did Melanie step away? Hi, Kanisha, good to see you, Kanisha. Hi, Melanie. No, man, you look good. You look good. Latoya, I'm not getting any response from the other people. What about Romualda? Hyacinth? Not seeing any responses from those persons. And somebody signing in St. Lucia National Committee?
Delari doesn't have a camera.
Okay, all right. Sorry, Delari.
Okay, so are we good?
I think we're good.
Is this approved, Dr. Perkins?
It's approved. How do you want us to do it? You want us to go, ah, or you want us to?
We can say
you
1,
wish.
2, 3 and smile. Okay, thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Katerina. And no, thank you everyone for your time, for your participation. We'll be sharing the link again for the knowledge product with everyone. We invite you to disseminate it, to use it. We remain available should you have any questions. We really hope it's picked up by stakeholders in policymaking, but as well in academia. And Latoya, there you are connected. Hi. And we thank you so much for joining us today. We will keep in touch as well about future opportunities for engagement with UNESCO and the University of the West Indies. And thank you so much for your time. And until next time, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Take care, all.
Thank you, Paola.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, Prof.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.